Thank you all for joining this webinar today. My name is Laura Cameron. I work with the IISD, and I'm going to open up our call today and then pass it off to our moderator. Before we started, I wanted to just situate myself, the land that I'm on. I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba right now, based on Treaty 1 territory, which is the homelands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene people, and it's also the homeland of the Red River Métis. In Winnipeg, we get our power from generating stations in Treaty 1, 3, and 5 territory, and our drinking water comes from the shores of Shoal Lake, 39 and 40 First Nations. So today, IISD has convened this webinar following a recent report that we launched called Navigating Energy Transitions, Mapping the Road to 1.5 degrees, which we're going to get into. So we wanted to share some of the results from that report today and dive deeper into a conversation on what modeling 1.5 energy scenarios means for us here in Canada. It's particularly an important conversation here and now, given that aligning these scenarios can inform plans for industries and economic opportunities, and also given that the Canada Energy Regulator is set to release net zero scenarios this year, and it's critical that this scenario aligns with international best practices on this modeling so that governments and the private sector have the information that they need to make 1.5 aligned decisions. So before I hand it over, I just wanted to do some housekeeping notes. For those who aren't familiar with Zoom, at the bottom of your window, you should see both a Q&A and a chat box. So we'll welcome you to put your questions in for the panelists throughout the webinar. You can add your questions into the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible towards the latter half of the webinar. If you have any other comments or logistical questions, you can add them into the chat. Or if you wanted to add where you're calling in from, that's great too. And with that, I will introduce our moderator. So Dan Vinelovich has 2 decades of experience working at the interface between climate policy and politics. He is the principal of Polaris Strategy and Insight, formerly a deputy director at Clean Energy Canada at SFU, and a Clean 50 recipient. He's frequently called upon to testify before regulatory and legislative bodies and quoted in the media, and he regularly publishes commentary in Canada's leading publications. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks so much, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here today to moderate what I think is going to be a really interesting discussion. I confess I have a love-hate relationship with energy and climate models. I love and appreciate how they can paint a picture of different futures that are informed by policy and technology and investment choices that we can make. Flip side of that is I dislike how oftentimes they are abused, treated as predictive forecasts that are often used to reinforce people's priors, and oftentimes to try to protect the status quo or business as usual. And for that reason, I think that the work that IISD has done exploring multiple different modeled pathways is really valuable. And with those being different pathways to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. I think we all acknowledge that Canada has all kinds of both opportunities and challenges ahead of us, not the least of which is how we choose to navigate the energy transition and whatever pathway the world ends up on route to net zero. And the question of how Canada contributes our fair share towards achieving net zero. I think a key difference between countries that have had significant success in cutting their carbon pollution and embracing clean energy, and those that aren't experiencing that same degree of success really boils down to whether they are aligning their actions with the world as they want it to be, which is a world accelerating towards net zero, or whether they're aligning their actions with the world that would result from a business as usual trajectory. I think that the outcome outcome that we promise, that we plan for, and that we act to achieve is the outcome we'll get. And so if we hedge towards the status quo and the business as usual, then that's the trajectory we're going to put ourselves on. And as a friend said to me, we make the future happen. The future doesn't happen to us. So we are empowered to make certain choices and to create the future that we want. So with that context, I'd like to just briefly introduce the three speakers that we have for you today. First, we're going to have a presentation from IISD's Olivier Bois-Boncoursk. Olivier is a policy analyst who works on energy transition scenarios with the organization's energy program. His work focuses on the policy implications of net zero emission scenarios and the phase out of oil and gas production in line with the Paris Agreement goals. Prior to joining IISD, he worked for the United Nations Environment Program, the Danish Technical University Partnership, the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin, and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He holds a master's degree in international economics from the Berlin School of Economics and Law. Then we're going to hear from Caroline Lee from the Canadian Climate Institute. She's the research lead on the Institute's mitigation team and brings to that role a diverse background in international climate and energy policy analysis. She has previously worked as an energy policy analyst at the International Energy Agency. I'm sure many people on this call today have read last year's World Energy Outlook and all of the modeling that comes out of the IEA. She was also a climate change mitigation analyst at the government of New Brunswick and an energy consultant with Navius Research, who many of you are probably also familiar with for the climate and energy modeling they do. She holds an MA in resource management from Simon Fraser University. And then last but not least, we're going to hear from Jan Gorski of the Pembina Institute. He's the director of the organization's oil and gas program, and he's based out of Calgary. He's got experience in policy development, emissions and energy modeling, and he represents the Institute externally on numerous committees. Prior to joining Pembina, Jan was a project engineer for Clearstone Engineering, where he led domestic and international emissions measurement and reduction studies in the oil and gas sector. He holds a master's degree in mechanical engineering and a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering, both from Carleton University. So after we hear from each of the speakers, I'm going to have a bit of a discussion with them, have some questions, but then we also want to answer as many of your questions as we have time for as well. So throughout the presentations, feel free to be submitting questions. Those are going to be collated and passed along. We'll get to as many of them as we can. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Olivier to get us started.
Thank you very much, Dan, for the introduction and the context setting of those most useful. So indeed, my presentation is mainly going to focus on the findings that were published in our latest report called Navigating Energy Transitions. And so we're going to try to answer the following question in the presentation, which is, what do energy scenarios tell us about the 1.5 degree compatible energy future? So we use integrated assessment model to answer this question, mainly because they're most useful tool for climate policy, and they really enable us to understand how various energy choices affect our ability to comply with different climate goals. So they are models of the energy, of the economy, and of the climate. So by tweaking different assumptions, different technology choices, and different policy decisions, then they enable us to understand what are their impact on other elements of the clean energy transition. So for these reasons and others, they influence expectation of energy producers, energy consumers, and investors and policymakers on the energy supply outlook. And in turn, this then contribute to steer energy producers' investment decisions and also financial actors' assessment of the trends in the energy market. However, IAM do have some challenges associated to working with them. So one of the main ones that we've identified in our study is that they still tend to rely quite heavily, more than often, on large-scale carbon sequestration, which with today's technology still remains quite unviable and unfeasible at these really large scale. So to find and assess sort of what are the the scenarios that are consistent with the feasible deployment and sustainable capacity of these methods. So we've dug into the the IPCC Scenario Explorer database, which publishes publicly online all of the pathway that the IPCC assesses to make its report. So out of the 1,200 pathway that were considered by the Working Group 3, only about 100 limits warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we've extracted all of these data, all the data from this 100 pathway, and then looked at what are the level of carbon sequestration done with the 3 different carbon sequestration methods laid out there. And then we've extracted all of the scenarios which had level of fossil CCS and bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which are above the feasibility threshold that the IPCC assessed to be possible with the current technologies and their future development. And we've done the same thing with the afforestation and reforestation, which can have some concern on biodiversity, water use, land rights, etc. So we use the maximum sustainable potential there. So that's enabled us to create a subset of 26 pathways that limits warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then from then on, we've extracted key features of the energy transition from this subset of pathways. So we're taking medians of key features of the energy transition from these 26 pathways. So one of the first thing we've looked at, and I'm going to present now, is the 1.5 degree consistent oil and gas phase-out pathway. So as I'm sure most of you already know, the International Energy Agency now also publishes a 1.5 degree consistent pathway, which I'm showing here. So it has an about 70% reduction in oil and gas production by 2050. And importantly, it concluded that in their scenario, there's no room for new oil and gas development beyond the fields that are already producing or under development. And interestingly, our analysis of IPCC pathway showed that actually this conclusion is also supported by the IPCC, which was an important finding because many actors, financial actors and banks decided to revert to using the IPCC when they heard that the IEA didn't support any new oil and gas development, because the IPCC is not policy prescriptive on this front. However, when we look at the viable and sustainable 1.5 degree pathway, then we show that this conclusion is also supported by the IPCC. And this is because the embodied emission in the fields that are already producing and under development, as shown in gray here in the slide, would be enough to by themselves consume the entirety of the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius in the oil and gas sector. So all new fields and new exploration would all come in excess of the associated carbon budget for this sector in 1.5 degree pathways. And actually by 2050, we could see about 50% more emission that would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 if all of the license reserve that are shown in red here would be exploited. So yeah, so basically in order to assess the robustness of this finding, we also wanted to look at several other pathways from groups like ARENA, other illustrative mitigation pathways shown in the IPCC Working Group 3 report, but also other energy consultancies. And we even looked at some oil and gas companies' 1.5 degree pathway. So all these pathways are plotted here in this graph, which is a bit messy to understand, but basically the important point to see is that they all have an at least 65% reduction in oil and gas by 2050. Some pathways momentarily go above the level of production that's consistent with the field that are under development or already producing. But what we find actually in the data by digging down into each of the individual assumptions in this model is that oil and gas phase-out pathways are highly sensitive to the assumption made on carbon dioxide removal technologies and fossil CCS. And so as you see, the top line in green is actually the only pathway that doesn't respect the feasibility threshold that the IPCC set for the deployment of carbon sequestration through fossil CCS. And that's why momentarily goes above the the amount of the production volume that's consistent with sticking with the fields that are already producing or under development. But in all cases, they would need to retire their fields in the second half of this century and deploy significantly more carbon sequestration in the second half of the century. So in order to phase out oil and gas at these rates shown in this pathway here, then we need to significantly scale up wind and solar technologies, which have the most mitigation potential at the lowest cost. So by looking at the solar and wind capacity deployment in the selected IPCC pathway, that we showed that we need about more than 800 billion investment in wind and solar combined by 2030 annually. So that's equivalent to about 1,000 gigawatts of new capacity added per year. And unfortunately, the forecast of investment made by Bloomberg Energy Finance, which is actually one of the most optimistic forecaster in the space, show that we only expect to have about half the investment required to deploy the required wind and solar capacity. So this leaves a large investment gap of about 830 billion per year, which is quite significant, but this is by no means to say that there's a lack of energy investment or energy spending in the world, because actually we've assessed then the investment that are forecasted to be spent in new oil and gas fields, so the ones that are incompatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and these ones are actually bigger than what would be needed to bridge the investment gap. So really just to say that there's no lack of capital globally, and then it's a matter of reorienting private capital flows. And so in order to actually deliver this private capital flows, net zero pledges need to be significantly strengthened to be more credible and consistent and aligned with 1.5. So actually an analysis of oil and gas net zero targets that was done by New Climate Institute, with whom we partner for producing this report, show that they typically include very incomplete emission disclosures, so typically only focusing on scope 1 and 2, which is only the upstream emission from the extraction and production of fossil fuels, which is only about 15 to 20% of the entire sector's emission. They also have inadequate specification of their own emission reduction alongside their net zero pledges. So this lack of transparency makes it very hard to assess whether their policy in place could actually meet their target. And then they rely overwhelmingly on contentious offsetting practices, so shoving the hard job of sequestering carbon emission in the second half of century through afforestation, reforestation, or unproven technology at scale, such as fossil carbon capture and storage. So that's why when we looked at oil and gas company net zero pledges, then we typically see that they plan to increase their production volumes over the forthcoming decades. So actually, if Canada were to produce an amount of oil and gas that would be consistent with its field that are already producing or under development, then it would see its production decrease by about 20% by 2030 and 70% by the middle of the century. However, the Canada Energy Regulator current policy plans shows an increase of production until the 2040s and then plateauing thereafter, while its evolving policy scenario still have emission increase until the 2030s and then slowly decreasing thereafter, which is actually really much in line with what the Canadian Association for Petroleum Producer forecasts for the industry. So this would imply a lot more new fields to be developed and new exploration to be done in order to meet that type of supply, which would be in contradiction with what the integrated assessment model show is required to limit warming to 1.5. So Canada net zero strategy requires significant improvement to align with the global context of the Paris Agreement and limit warming to 1.5. So we suggest that should emphasize early and deep and absolute emission reduction. Also target all scope of emissions, and not only scope 1 and 2 emission, but also take into account the combustion of the oil and gas that it then sells and put on the global market that end up being combusted and put into the atmosphere. And then it should also include that all sector does its fair share. So that includes the oil and gas sector, but not only. And provinces should also adopt more stringent net zero policy if they don't already have some. So here are the key messages that I'd like you to take away from this presentation. First of all, is that all major energy pathways that we've analyzed all show that there's no room for new oil and gas fields to be developed. Actually, the selected IPCC pathway that we've assessed showed that by 2030, we need about 30% reduction in production and consumption globally, and about 65% by the middle of the century. So for this reason, Canada's oil and gas production plans are not currently aligned with the Paris Agreement temperature goal. As we've just seen, the current policies actually would have production keep rising until the 2040s, and the current policy is not much more ambitious. So accordingly, we also suggest that domestic oil and gas company should strengthen their net zero target. Comprehensive and transparent reporting are essential to ensure accountability and credibility of their own emission target. So on this, thank you for listening and being here in this webinar today. And this is the report that we've launched just at the end of last year. And so there will be a link posted and we'll share the slides with you later on. So on this, I will hand over back to Dan.
I think we'll actually just go right to Caroline and then Jan will follow her.
Great, thanks Olivier, thanks Dan. Let me just share my screen here. All right, so hi everyone, my name is Caroline Lee. I'm with the Canadian Climate Institute. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so responding to those interesting points that Olivier made, as well as the ones that Dan made in his introduction, talking about a couple of things about what I think are is the right role for models, the value of models in how we think about the transition to 1.5. And then secondly, show you, kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of the specific results that Olivier has showed you, especially from the IEA, and then also from some of the analysis that we've done here at the Climate Institute on the future of oil and gas in different energy transition scenarios. I didn't introduce where I'm from. I'm with the Canadian Climate Institute, and if you're not familiar with us, we are relatively new here on the scene. We were established just about, I think, over 3 years ago just. We are a federally funded research organization. Our mandate is essentially to do research and analysis on key climate policy issues, and really it's all centered around policy. So we aim to provide policy recommendations on how to essentially better tackle climate change in Canada. So I'm a part of the mitigation team, and much of the work here on our team focuses on getting Canada to our net zero goals by mid-century. So there are two parts where I see the value of models, and then secondly, diving deep into some particular results on oil and gas in particular. Olivier was referring to integrated assessment models, and he was talking to their use. I'm going to focus on energy economy models. For all intents and purposes, I think the messages are the same. Energy economy models simply don't consider the explicit relationship with the physical climate system. They focus primarily on the economic and energy systems. So I made this little table to try to summarize my thoughts on what I think the value for models is in our decision making and helping guide our decision making along the path towards 1.5. So, you know, on the left, I have a column listing things models I think do pretty well. So one is that they're good at showing what I'm calling internally consistent views of the future. So if you think that this will happen, then what other conditions need to be fulfilled in order for that to occur? Now I'm going to give you an example of that in a couple of slides. The second thing I think models are good at is identifying key drivers of trends. So, you know, what is it that's causing a trend or a change that we're seeing? And one big change that we have found in our work, and I think this is obvious to maybe lots of people on the call, is that what drives domestic oil production in Canada is really primarily the stuff that happens outside of our borders. So international oil demand is a key driver of domestic oil production. What that implies is that it's really less about domestic policy that impacts domestic oil production. A third thing that models are good at is identifying these big kind of directional trends or changes. So for example, what I think models are showing us increasingly, and Olivier showed us this too, is that, you know, demand for fossil fuels across the spectrum, gas, coal, and oil, is not set to increase in any scenario. In fact, we see some pretty significant declines, certainly in 1.5 consistent scenarios, but even in more conservative transition scenarios, we're seeing the lack of long-term growth of these. So those are some of the big kind of directional changes that models are really useful at telling us. Models are perhaps less good at things like, you know, predicting specific outcomes with high precision. So the exact level of oil and gas production in a particular province in a given year, or the exact market share of solar and wind. You know, inevitably models are wrong when it comes to defining, making predictions of precise details. Secondly, you know, models vary on this too, and I'm of course I'm generalizing here. I think models vary in terms of how well that they can represent some of these things, but if I'm going to generalize, they're less good at simulating what I'm calling a messy transition. So what models do is they're really good at simulating a smooth transition, a smooth line from one, you know, point A to point B, not a disorderly line. And because they're better at simulating broad trends, averages across multiple years, they're also less good at simulating these big stochastic random events that are very difficult to predict, like, for example, the COVID pandemic and then the associated recession. And then thirdly, you know, models, again, vary to the extent to which they can do this, but they're not great at representing the complexity of human decision making. So they tend to optimize a trajectory from A to B based on, you know, sometimes minimizing costs. We know that human decision making is complex, and models have a hard time replicating perfectly the complexity of how decisions are made by humans in our economy. So I think using models for what they're good at, which is, you know, these big trends, looking at what's useful when we look at internally consistent views of the future, they can be really powerful decision-making tools. And I think Dan said this already, but beyond the specific kind of energy and climate policy and investment decisions that they can influence, I think even broader than that, modeling studies can also influence how we define the problem itself and how we frame that problem. So one example is how the International Energy Agency, which I would consider, you know, a global authority in defining long-term energy transition scenarios, they hadn't developed a truly 1.5 compatible scenario until a couple of years ago. So not having such a scenario, in a way, was an implicit acknowledgement that goal wasn't worthy, or perhaps that wasn't a feasible goal to reach. I think since 2021, I think was the first time they released a net zero energy scenario. That has really shifted at a global level the discourse around what's necessary and what's needed and what the goal itself should be. So they can be really powerful exercises in that way too. So next, I'll move on to what do models actually say about the future of fossil fuels in different scenarios. I'm going to show some results here for 1.5 compatible scenarios, but I'll also show results from other scenarios. So I'll focus on the IEA work. That's what I know best, but I'll also bring in some findings from our own analysis here at the Climate Institute. So Dan mentioned the World Energy Outlook in his intro. That was IEA's latest big modeling report that they released. One of the big findings from that is that for the first time, they had never published a report that had these findings before, that there was no long-term growth of any fossil fuel across any scenario. So that's kind of a big deal, that even in the most conservative scenario, there is no fossil fuel that sees long-term sustained growth. And that includes natural gas, whereas previously there was more sustained growth in natural gas overall. This was the first year where we didn't see that happening. So here on the graph, you see the representation of, there's three key scenarios. The STEPS scenario is the scenario that defines the outcomes if we make incremental policy progress. So it's a bit more conservative in that way. So we failed to reach 1.5. We failed to reach many domestic long-term climate goals, so net zero climate goals. The NZE is their most ambitious one, where the world reaches 1.5, and then the APS somewhere in the middle. So I think what this shows is that, yes, fossil fuels, on the other hand, there's no rosy prospect for the long-term growth of fossil fuels. At the same time, we know that fossil fuels aren't going away tomorrow. They will remain in the economy for decades to come. But I do think it's important to look honestly at the long-term prospects of these types of fuels. We know that the world, and the IEA is showing this now, is moving away from fossil fuels. I think the question is simply how quickly. So here I'm focusing specifically on oil. Not much to say, except we see that in all of the scenarios, we see a peak in oil demand. So that means oil demand fails to grow in the long term. Even if we only make incremental policy progress, so even in the most conservative scenario, which is the STEP scenario that you see in the blue, oil demand still peaks in just over a decade. So either way, whatever we assume, the IEA is projecting a peak in oil demand. I want to bring in here some findings from our own work at the Climate Institute. So a couple of years ago, we did some pathways analysis, looking specifically at Canada, on how Canada can get to net zero. And I want to make that distinction clear, that our analysis really focused on how to get Canada in particular to net zero by 2050, as opposed to the entire world. What this graph is showing you is really different bands of trajectories or scenarios of oil production to 2050. So in the green band, what you see is that it essentially the world, so an international kind of a global community that accelerates its transition away from fossil fuels, including oil demand. It's a world where the oil price drops. And I would say this is the closest set of scenarios that we ran to a global 1.5 scenario. So in that scenario, it's very consistent with what other people are saying, that the domestic oil production drops. I also, though, want to focus on the other scenarios that we ran. And in particular, that red band is where we see actually continued growth in Canadian oil production, even when Canada reaches its net zero goal. So how does that happen? And this is where I'm going to bring in an example of how models are really useful in trying to identify what internally consistent assumptions are about different future views of the world. So if Canada is to meet net zero, if Canada is to continue producing and growing oil production, what else needs to happen? And we came up with a set of 4 pretty specific criteria for those scenarios to be true. So first, in order for oil and gas, oil in particular, production to continue growing while Canada meets net zero, the world needs to stall on climate action. So the world will fail to reach 1.5, and it'll fail to meet even less ambitious climate goals in those scenarios. Not only will oil prices, though, remain high in that world, there needs to be an expectation that oil prices will remain high in order to drive investment. Thirdly, the emissions intensity of oil production needs itself to drop very significantly so that the direct emissions of production need to come to basically zero by 2050. And then fourthly, there needs to be very significant adoption and deployment of carbon removal, so negative emissions technologies, including more advanced forms of carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, which, you know, I think it is safe to say is a highly uncertain outcome. So when we hear claims that Canada can reach net zero and maintain or grow its oil production, I think this is the type of world that we're talking about, and these are the types of conditions that need to be met. And again, I want to emphasize, these are the scenarios where Canada really itself is meeting net zero, but the world is not necessarily. Here quickly on natural gas, just to show that the IEA also shows a failure for natural gas to continue growing, even in its most conservative scenarios. The light purple is where you see unabated natural gas, or natural gas without carbon capture and storage. And again, underscoring the message that even overall gas demand, it doesn't grow in the long term. I will say also that inevitably, as countries accelerate and adopt more climate policies, the long-term projections for natural gas will only decline, because the STEPS scenario is based on current and announced policies in countries. So as they adopt more climate policies, inevitably, I think the prospects for natural gas overall will decline. And let me end here just by saying that, and Olivier picked up on this point too, and I'll elaborate, is that I think it's important to emphasize really both sides of the energy transition, primarily on the need to reduce drastically reliance of fossil fuels. But of course, at the same time, what we also need to be doing is ramping up, accelerating the deployment of other clean sources of supply. So that's what you see in the figures in front of you. You see fossil supply in the red across different scenarios, and then in the green, non-fossil supply. And you see it growing in all of the scenarios, but at different paces. And I think an important point to take home here is that regardless of the scenario that we're seeing clean energy deployment rising really significantly. It's again really just a question of how fast that growth will take place. So I want to emphasize that yes, it's really important to think about declining fossil fuel supply and demand. At the same time, we need to be pushing for the replacement, the substitute energy sources, which are clean energy. And actually, I think I'll stop here in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. I'll jump right into it. I mean, two really good presentations. I think some of the work that Olivia presented was really fascinating. It shows some of this modeling. One comment I want to make is I think we need to be a little careful sometimes when we talk about production and demand for fossil fuels. And actually, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. So Dan already introduced me. My name is Jan Gorski. I'm with the PEMD Institute. For those of you who don't know us, we're a clean energy think tank that's been around in Canada for 40 years, originally founded in Alberta, working on oil and gas issues, but now we work across the full set of climate and energy issues across all sectors of the economy. So going back to, I want to talk about production and demand, and we need to think about the fact that the challenge is that we're still using fossil fuels, and so we need to make sure that we reduce demand before we reduce supply, that you can't reduce supply without reducing demand. And I think this point is really exemplified by the crisis that's going on in Europe right now, where we see that there's lots of demand, but there isn't enough supply. And this has had pretty big impacts, rising energy costs, inflation, and in Europe, even more direct consequences in that they don't have enough energy to heat their homes. So the thing we really need to address is demand. But thankfully, as Caroline showed, most of the predictions now, most of the forecasts show that demand for all fossil fuels, including oil and gas, will start a long-term decline at some point in 2030. I won't go into this into too much detail since Caroline did a really great job of explaining some of these IEA scenarios and how they translate into Canada. And the IEA also shows that in Canada, the impact of that in Canada is that production of oil is likely to decline in Canada in line with those IEA scenarios. I'll dig into a little bit about why that's happening. The big driver, and I'll focus on oil, the big driver for this decline in demand in oil is the uptake in EVs. More people are buying electric vehicles. And that trend is accelerating over time. And it's even continued throughout the pandemic. Despite all the supply chain issues, electric vehicles are becoming more and more popular every day. And part of this is because their costs are coming down. And the other reason is that action on climate policy is accelerating across the world. More and more countries every year are starting to create commitments and implement policy to meet those commitments to reduce emissions. So we're seeing this trend over time that action on climate is growing, costs of renewable technologies are coming down, and as a result, we expect to see oil demand decline. The only question is how fast will it decline? And most of that, as Caroline mentioned, is not driven by what's happening in Canada. It's actually driven by global trends, by what's happening outside of Canada. So in the US, we've seen the Inflation Reduction Act, a historic piece of legislature that's created ripples throughout the world and is going to drive an immense amount of climate action. China as well has climate targets and is really winning the race on electric vehicles. They're ahead of a lot of countries in terms of both production and uptake of electric vehicles. Not just cars, but scooters and mopeds are really picking up there, which is having a huge impact on oil demand in China. So what does all of this mean for Canada's oil and gas production? We know that demand is going to decline. We know that, we can see that the impacts that's going to have on Canada and that production here is likely to decline as well. So oil is a global commodity. So whatever happens around the world has an impact here in Canada. And the challenge here is that a lot of our oil production is high cost and high carbon intensity, which means that as the global demand for oil starts to drop, the price will likely come down. And some of those projects, especially those high cost projects, oil sands facilities in Canada, will likely face economic pressures. And the other variable is carbon intensity. Our oil production is really emissions intensive. And I think now we're starting to get to the point where banks and investors are starting to realize this, and they're starting to consider their investments in relation to the carbon intensity of various resources. So we haven't gotten there yet, but I think there's momentum on this, and that investment will flow towards lower intensity resources. So as demand drops and prices start to drop, some of those projects won't be economic, and they will likely be shut in. And I think we still haven't normalized this in Canada, because what we've seen in the past decade, for example, as we've had various volatilities within the oil and gas sector, oil demand or oil production in Canada has stayed very stable. Whereas in the US, if you look at what happens there, because shale oil is quite expensive to produce, as prices go down and up, shale oil really follows that curve. And shale oil production has gone up when prices were high, and it goes down when prices are low. And I think as we enter this period of long-term decline in demand, we're going to see the same thing in Canada, We just haven't seen it yet because Canada's production is it's more resilient to short-term shocks, but I don't think it's resilient to these long-term shocks. Gas is a different story because gas isn't a fully global commodity. You need LNG export terminals, and we have a limited amount of these terminals. So gas doesn't flow as easily around the world. Canada doesn't have any LNG terminals yet. And if you look at what the IEA says, they predict that if climate action continues along its current course, we're not going to need any more LNG demand. In fact, it'll decline from here on out. So this is something that we need to consider here in Canada. So what does this mean for the oil and gas sector in Canada? You know, we have a federal government that's pursuing an oil and gas cap, trying to reduce emissions from the oil and gas sector. There's a lot of talk about carbon capture and storage. And from my perspective, what this means is we're still going to see some amount of carbon capture and storage in the oil and gas sector, but it needs to be really targeted. Oil sands are long-term projects, 30, 40-year projects, and same goes for carbon capture. These are big capital investments, and these are projects that will be around for a long time. And so we need to be careful, and companies need to really select where they do CCUS and choose the projects that are likely to be around longer, and acknowledge that some projects are likely to be uneconomic and will be shut in at some point. And there's a cautionary tale here. I'll bring up the example of the Petronova facility in the US. So this was a coal plant that installed a carbon capture system, and it wasn't being permanently stored. It was being sold and used for enhanced oil recovery. And what happened was, as the price of oil dropped, enhanced oil recovery no longer became economic. And so that oil facility shut in, and the carbon capture plant now also had to shut down because they had nowhere to send their carbon dioxide. So this is an example of a poor bet, and why we need to make sure that we make smart bets on where we do CCUS in Canada. And I'll stop there, turn it back to Dan.
Great, thank you, Jan, and thank you to all of the panelists. I think we've got lots of fodder for a good conversation here. Caroline, I think you did a great job of explaining, at least from your perspective, the things that models are good at and the things that maybe models aren't so good at. But wanted to create an opportunity for Jan or Olivier to similarly comment on models and how they're used, including in the Canadian context. We've got the Canadian Energy Regulator who does some modeling. They'll be coming in with new modeling. So from your perspective, anything to add in terms of, kind of strengths, weaknesses, and how we can best make use of these sorts of models, including the CER's upcoming modeling?
Nothing really to add from my perspective. I think Caroline did a great job of outlining the pros and cons. I think models have their advantages. They're good for tracking long-term trends, and as she said, they're not great at giving you precise, specific answers to very specific questions.
All right. So moving on, one of the, we are hearing a lot of debate in Canada about, the future of both our oil sands and our gas via LNG exports. And globally, there is kind of this conversation of, okay, if we're going to have oil and gas production declining over time because the world is, shifting towards more climate action, then maybe we should be considering, having some preference for oil and gas that is produced with lower carbon intensity than from other jurisdictions. And so, for example, we've got Sultan Al Jaber, who is the CEO of the United Arab Emirates state oil company. He's also going to be president of COP28, which got some controversy. But he likes to go around talking about how the UAE produces some of the lowest GHG intensity oil and gas in the world, and so therefore, their oil and gas should be like the last molecules that are produced as we have that decline happening. We hear that in the Canadian context. A lot of boosters of Canadian LNG like to say, well, it would be the cleanest LNG in the world, lowest greenhouse gas intensity. Flip side is then we've got the oil sands, which produce higher GHG intensity oil, and absent really significant investments in carbon capture and storage, they would kind of be squeezed out. So in Canada, on the one hand, sometimes we like to tout how it should be the cleanest, it should be the last produced, but then the flip side is we still say, well, but we want oil sands to continue to produce for decades to come. So I'm curious, from any of you or each of you, what do you think of this notion that that we will see things unfold where, in addition to price, greenhouse gas intensity actually matters, and that the market might actually, in some way, prefer it? So Olivier, we'll start with you.
Thanks a lot, Dan, and for Jan and Caroline for your presentations. That was really insightful and really great insights into the usefulness of model and the Canadian context. But to answer your question, Dan, I think that one of the first things to consider when talking about sort of the who is responsible for which emission globally, and whether there's an argument for having the lowest emission barrel as the last one standing. I think in the Canadian context, I think it's important to consider also the equity and justice consideration of who gets to benefit globally from the remaining of the carbon budget. So Canada is a really high income country with also one of the largest historical emitters. And as it has a highly diversified economy, it's in a much better position than any other countries or any oil and gas producer, or most of them, to phase out their oil and gas production faster. So it would be much harder, for example, for countries that are emerging economies and that are highly dependent on their fossil fuel and that have contributed much less to climate change historically. So if actually Canada were to take into account the Paris Agreement principle of the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacities, then Canada should be one of the first countries to phase out its oil and gas production, regardless of whether it's low emission or high emission barrels. But from that, the IEA conclusion does not say that Canada has to stop producing and selling oil and gas, but simply that it needs to stop developing any new oil and gas field. And that's without taking into consideration the equity and justice consideration, because if you do that, then you might have to go even faster than this to leave more room for other countries to phase out the production. But to come back to the lowest emission barrel argument, I think it's quite flawed itself, because it also only accounts for the upstream emission that comes from the oil and gas sector. So it's only mitigating some percentage of 20% of the entire sector's emission, which is the extraction and production. So it cannot be applied at the source necessarily, but no, sorry, on the cars or vehicles, or in so it's mainly used for the upstream emission and energy generation. And actually, Canada's oil and gas sector, I mean, the export of the emission, which is about 80% of the oil and gas sector, constitute more than the entirety of Canadian emission in 1 year. So what is burned from the oil and gas sector is more than the entire emission of the entire Canadian economy. So again, like, it's important to consider all scope of emission there. And then just to finish on the carbon capture and storage capacities used to mitigate upstream emission, I think they're still really expensive and not effective at the scale, and they're still largely inefficient and flawed in many cases. I mean, I think worldwide there's only about 26 large-scale commercial CCS projects that exist, and only 8 of them are actually dedicated for long-term CO2 sequestration, and all the other are used for enhanced oil recovery. So in total, they sequester very little carbon, and many projects have been flawed with cost overrun, delays, and just in economic issue, as Jan just explained. So that would be my 2 cents on this question.
Go ahead, Jan.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I have a slightly different perspective. I think we need to reduce our reliance on oil and gas, but as we do that, I think we also need to shift to the oil and gas that we do produce and use. It needs to be produced in the lowest carbon way possible. So I think the world is headed that way. I don't think we have those mechanisms yet, but it's also a dynamic space. It's changing over time, and there's still room for various countries and companies. The Saudis could say that they're ahead right now, but that story could change in 5-10 years. Someone else could reduce their emissions and beat them to it. And I think we need a little bit of that. We need a little bit of that competition to drive down and head towards low emissions production.
Great. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, specifically on the oil sands. And so there's the Pathways Alliance, which is comprised of the biggest oil sands producers, have come together and are saying that they've got a plan and that they are aligned with net zero. And I guess the first big caveat on that is when they say net zero, they don't include the scope 3 emissions. So the emissions associated with burning the products that they produce, that's not contained within that commitment that they have to net zero. To Olivier's point about the 80% of emissions that come from that final end use. So their commitment is just focused on that 20% that come from the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. But even at that narrower scope, interested to hear what you make of the claim that they've got a plan and that net zero is achievable. Is it accurate? And if so, is it plausible? What would need to happen in order for them to achieve that?
Happy to weigh in on that. So we wrote a report last fall waiting to launch, and we followed that up where we evaluated the plans, the actions, and the words of oil sands companies. And I think what we see from Pathways is we see the rough outlines of the plan, but we don't see the details, and we haven't yet seen the investments of how they're actually going to make that plan happen. And I think it's fair to say that CCUS isn't going to happen overnight, but we do need to see some progress at some point and some more details on how they're going to achieve the commitments that they've made.
Olivier or Caroline, anything to add on that?
I'm happy to add a small point maybe on that. And actually, I think that it's valuable if Pathway Alliance wants to put into place like some CCUS capacities on their fields that are already producing and the ones that are under production, under development today. But I think, again, to take into account the global context of meeting the 1.5 degree target, even if it's applied to new development in the oil and gas field, it's still very much in a position to what integrated assessment model indicate that would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And just to add also, as they're highly expensive and inefficient, and in the global context, I think that if they want to mitigate their upstream emission for the fields that are already producing, I think that's good. But considering the record profit that oil and gas companies are currently making, I just don't think that it should be subsidized by the federal government. And that if they want to mitigate their upstream emission, then it's valuable and we should strive for that. But as long as it's for existing fields and the ones that are under development, but not to new fields.
Okay, so related to that, so let's presume that we've got oil sands projects that are continuing. They're making investments in carbon capture. They're reducing emissions. Doing their best to contribute towards achieving Canada's targets. Even in that scenario, given what we're seeing in terms of accelerated uptake of EVs and the demand destruction for oil for transportation fuels that goes with that, I wonder if any of you have any comments on the risk of Canadian oil sands projects becoming stranded assets because they can't actually deliver sufficient rates of return, relative to their cost structure. if in fact we do see that demand destruction happening faster than perhaps is currently anticipated? What's the risk of stranded assets in the oil sands?
Happy to comment, but happy to let someone else go first if they want to start off. Okay, thumbs up from Olivier. So I think the oil sands is sometimes viewed as one piece, but actually there's a spectrum on there. And I think, Dan, to your point, like as oil demand starts to decline, I think there's a pretty big risk of stranded assets, but I don't think it'll affect all facilities equally. So I think there's some facilities within there that are very high cost and that have a high risk, and there's some that are probably better suited. And I think we need to think about this and talk about it in an honest way, because some of these facilities, it makes sense to invest in. Other ones, the high cost ones, I don't think it makes sense to invest in. They're likely going to be shut in at some point if oil prices drop far enough.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I can add a small piece of additional insights there. I mean, I think that there will be significant stranded assets if we implement stringent climate policies that are in line with the climate targets. But otherwise, I mean, I think that without supply side intervention, I think that the oil and gas industry could continue to develop their asset, and the economics might still be in their favor as long as it's still subsidized and facilitated. So I think it really depends on which type of climate policy we have, and if we want to be in line with 1 or even 2 degrees Celsius, then there will be stranded asset to a significant amount.
Great, thanks. So we're also seeing a resurgence of interest, at least from the media and from champions of the Canadian gas sector and LNG, just about LNG and the role that it's going to play, in part because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and what the implications for Russian gas and various countries looking to replace Russian gas with gas from elsewhere. So a lot of enthusiasm around prospects for LNG. We do have one LNG terminal that's currently under construction, another one that's been approved and just waiting on final investment decision, a few others in the regulatory queue. So curious what you think the role or prospects are for Canadian LNG, both within the current energy security context, but also thinking about a pathway to net zero. And wondering if you can also comment within that on what you think the prospects are for Canada to actually receive some credit for emissions that might be displaced through the consumption of that gas if, for example, it's replacing coal-fired power. So under the Paris Agreement, Article 6, there's this thing called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes that would allow a country, let's say Japan, starts importing Canadian LNG and they're using it to displace a coal-fired power plant, then the emissions differential, they could actually credit that over to Canada. Canada could apply that against our own domestic climate targets. So that's kind of the in theory how it could work. Should caution that in terms of hammering out the details of Article 6 and its implementation in kind of global international climate negotiations, all of those mechanisms, accounting, et cetera, don't yet exist. But we do hear from some folks in Canada that, well, we don't need to worry about being inconsistent with net zero, or we don't have to worry about the emissions that we would incur from producing that gas and liquefying it for export, because we can get these credits from elsewhere. So love to hear your perspectives on just the role and prospects for LNG, including that question of could we get these Article 6 credits. So Caroline, over to you.
Yeah, this is such a sticky question, I find, and it's really full of nuance here. So whereas I showed in my presentation that, overall natural gas demand and supply decline in all the scenarios, or at least fail to grow. The picture is more nuanced around one particular kind of natural gas, which is liquefied natural gas. And that's because there remains demand, as you say, in the short term, potentially in Europe to make up for supply gaps, and also in developing Asia, in part to soak away from coal. So this is the case, and we've seen actually the IEA is showing this, even in a net zero scenario, there is a little bit of a short-term increase in LNG capacity, followed by a really decisive decrease in LNG capacity over time globally. So perhaps the direction of LNG is a little bit less clear, although I think in the long term, we're not seeing strong LNG growth. But this makes decision-making in the short term a little bit more complicated for Canada. Because I think people are right to think there could be some short-term demand for the product. Now, I will say, rather than giving specific answers to some of these questions, maybe I'll just name some of the secondary questions that come to mind when it comes to LNG production from Canada. So one is, I know IISD has done work on this, in terms of project lead times. Can we quickly enough bring LNG online and export it to the markets, especially in Europe, before their policy to decrease demand, reliance on Russian gas starts to bite, and they actually don't need that much natural gas anymore? Second question is whether other countries could, other lower cost producers of LNG could feasibly outcompete Canada. So this is a global market. The US is really gunning to produce and expand its LNG export capacity. Qatar, other countries in the Middle East, the same. Not to say Canada doesn't stand a chance, but this could be a really competitive global market. And then if we want, we're focused particularly on this midstream infrastructure, so the liquefaction terminals. These have really long lifetimes. So what happens if maybe the energy transition happens faster than we anticipate? This type of infrastructure, in order to reduce the risk of being stranded, needs to be able to be retrofitted. For example, we hear all the time about LNG infrastructure being hydrogen ready, and that makes it net zero compatible. I think there are all sorts of questions that need to be answered around the economic viability and all kinds of other barriers to actually bringing hydrogen into these LNG terminals. So I think that term gets shoved around a lot, but I think we haven't really explored how feasible it is to make those retrofits happen in an economically viable way. And then the last thing really is around what the role of public funding is of these projects. We're seeing LNG Canada, and there are calls for public support and public financial support in particular of these projects. Does it make sense, given I think that there are legitimate risks of building this long-term infrastructure in a decarbonizing world? It's one thing to put that risk on the private sector, but a really big question around the role of, I think, public funding for these projects. So more questions than answers. I've spoken a lot, and I'm happy to talk about the IMO issue, but I thought I would give the floor to my other panelists before I take up more space here.
Happy to comment on the IDMOs. It's a complicated question, and I think there are legitimate cases where it needs to be explored. And the one that comes to mind to me is, for example, Quebec has a cap and trade system that's linked to California. And I think there's a legitimate question there of, ideally you actually want credits flowing between these two jurisdictions, and how do we make that happen? Can IDMOs play a role? I think that's something that's worth exploring. The question of LNG, to me, is a different question, because it's not an emissions credit that's being traded. It's a commodity, LNG. We're simply selling, Caroline talked about whether it makes sense or not, but theoretically speaking, it's just a commodity that's being sold to China or Asia or somebody else. There's no actual emissions credit at stake here. So I don't think there's any, in this current context, there's really no case to be made for an IDMO on a commodity.
Yeah, I think just,
go ahead, Caroline.
I was just going to build on that point that, selling LNG to an export market is currently a commercial transaction, like it's happening already. So what is the incentive for a country to give up an emissions credit for a business transaction that's happening today? I'm not clear on the answer to that. And then secondly, you know, there is a really important accounting challenge here in the way that our low carbon exports are not currently accounted for in Canada. In the way that the export of Canadian oil, we don't get dinged for exports of Canadian oil if it displaces, for example, I don't know, cleaner products in other countries. In the same way, according to current accounting rules, cleaner exports to displace dirtier sources in other countries is not accounted for, and it's not a benefit to Canada. It's accounted for in the receiving, the host nation. So I think in order for Canada to get credit for ITMOs for LNG in particular, there would need to be some pretty fundamental changes in the accounting system, which technically is possible, but I sort of cast doubt on the feasibility and the likelihood of that happening.
Anything to add on that, Olivier?
Maybe just a small additional commentary, and I think it's that all of what's been said there is also based on the premise that gas could be used as a transition fuel, and I think that this has also been quite debunked in many instances in some of the reports that IISD launched lately called Stepping Off the Gas, and I think it just mentions that basically, if you take into account all the fugitive emission from gas extraction, including the methane emission, well, it's not that much better, and it's not, so you don't save much emission. And actually, for gas and power generation, there's already some excellent alternatives that are already available and cost competitive. So again, I think it's just creating additional lock-in into a fossil fuel infrastructure to assume that gas could be used as a transition fuel, and I think that this needs to be debunked.
Okay, so I want to turn now to the clean energy side of this equation, and I think Caroline, you did a great job in using those figures from the IEA of showing how the decline of fossil fuels needs to be mirrored by a significant increase in the deployment of clean energy and renewable electricity, etc. That obviously is going to require significant amounts of investment. And even if we then just look within the Canadian context, where the oil and gas sector has seen such very significant scale of investment, we face a scenario in Canada where if we're going to get on a net zero trajectory, we're going to have to double or triple the amount of generating capacity of our electricity system, with a lot of wind and solar in particular, but also storage. Climate Institute did some great work on that last year with their electric federalism report. But Olivia, maybe I'll turn to you, because you also, you had that graphic depicting how, if we look at the kind of the scale and the rate of oil and gas investment, and if we transferred that over to clean energy, there's enough capital sloshing around out there. I think one of the challenges is that, at least to this point in time, the return on investment of putting that capital into oil and gas has exceeded that return on investment if it's put into wind or solar. So, what needs to happen to drive that shift in investment from fossil fuels into clean energy?
Thanks, Dan. And I think that's a great question, because indeed, like renewable energy projects, even if they're highly competitive and are highly efficient, they do face some financing issues, and some of them are also related to the fact that, in terms of competitiveness with oil and gas, is that there are still a whole lot of energy subsidies and preferential treatment to oil and gas company due to the risk profile from assessment in different financial institutions, but also that the capital cost structure of oil and gas projects are different, and they're actually favored by the financial system because they tend to have lower initial investment costs. So you first dig and explore really well, then you start having some oil and gas, and then so you have faster returns compared to a wind farm, which have a very high initial investment cost to develop hundreds of windmills and then at quite delayed return. So that increases the risk of the project, increased capital cost. And that becomes a really large problem, especially in emerging economies where interest rates are really high. Then the capital costs goes to the roof and makes these projects less competitive. So in this space, multilateral development bank have a huge role to play in order to give some guarantees, loans, or grants to certain projects in order to decrease the risk and decrease the capital cost and ensure that these projects go through working with local partners. And apart from that, in order to make renewable energy project even more competitive, then government can also have a huge role there by putting some feed-in tariffs or some long-term purchase agreements. Having carbon prices are also much useful to increase the relative competitiveness. And then the financial sector, it's also really key to have very transparent data on the emission associated to each project and their associated transition risks. So if company were to report more transparently through the mandatory reporting standards and on all scope of emission, then it would also give more information to financial institutions to be able to channel capitals where they can find like green opportunities that fits their mandate increasingly. So these are some of the key avenues to consider there. But yeah, I'm sure I think Carolyn has some thoughts as well there.
Yeah, I agree in particular with you on the importance of policy. I think in being the balance, the scale towards cleaner energy sources. In terms of electricity in particular, I think given the way that electricity is managed and regulated in Canada under these basically vertically integrated monopolies across most of the provinces of the country, not all, the business case, I guess, is only part of the driver for the types of electricity generation that end up being procured. So there are lots of other factors that are being decided upon by utilities, by regulators. So I think, you know, one example is the investment tax credit that we saw in the fall economic statement is also a really, I think, good news story for helping tip the balance. And at the same time, you know, if a utility decides simply not to procure wind and solar for a certain reason, even if it's financially advantageous, it won't happen. So I think there also needs to be really targeted intervention to decisions that are being made at the utility and the regulator level. So for example, you know, one recommendation that we made in the Big Switch report that Dan was mentioning is encouraging utilities and regulators to develop net zero compatible long-term energy plans. So making those plans, laying them out, showing how they're going to follow a pathway to net zero compatibility. I think things like that can really help kind of focus the decision making at that level, because I think the financial attributes of projects is only one, I think, element of the decision making, at least in Canada, in our vertically integrated systems here.
Great. I have a question here that's getting into some of the mechanics of the modeling that maybe you guys can just briefly touch on, and that is how carbon pricing factors into these various modeling efforts at the global scale or at the national scale, but then also including, you know, we are beginning to see the possible introduction of border carbon adjustments, which jurisdictions who have carbon pricing could put in place to, in effect, spread the carbon price signal to other markets that maybe don't have carbon pricing but want to be exporting goods into that region that does. So you could just comment briefly on how carbon pricing factors into these various models, whether it's used, how it's used, how you might be able to factor in things like border carbon adjustments.
I can speak from a Climate Institute perspective. Carbon pricing is actually oftentimes used as a proxy for all kinds of emissions reductions actions in the model. So it's an easy way to say, you know, we don't know exactly what types of policies are going to be implemented, but the implicit carbon price that those policies will generate is going to be reflected in a carbon price. So oftentimes what we do in our modeling is simply increase incrementally a carbon price path over time. You know, in a reference scenario, we'll follow policy announcements. So the federal government has announced a benchmark, a formal benchmark for carbon pricing. And then after that to 2050, sometimes our models simply ramp up the carbon price, the explicit carbon price, until we get to the outcome that we want. Again, as a proxy for additional climate policy that's needed. Border carbon adjustments are a little bit trickier to model. We haven't explicitly done that in our, I guess not very, very well yet. So I'd be curious to hear how other people seem to have addressed this, but I think no doubt because of the salience of the BCM issue, we'll have to figure out kind of a better way to represent it more accurately in our work. So happy to hear others' opinions on that.
Well, I think you summed it quite well, Caroline. And indeed, I mean, carbon prices are overwhelmingly used in most climate models. I mean, the work into the economic models that are used in integrated assessment models, and then it works into the mechanics of competitiveness for different technologies, for fossil fuels, and then eventually it sort of outputs an impact on final emissions. So indeed, like they do play a major role, and most of them assume carbon prices above $100 per tons of carbon. I think that's kind of typical price by 2050 for limiting warming to 1.5. And yeah, so that's definitely a central role, and an important one also in climate policies. Yeah.
Okay. I think we've got time for one last question here, and which can actually be a little bit of a look ahead. So as many people will know, the Canadian energy regulator does put out modeling looking at different scenarios for Canada's energy future. And after the last set of scenarios came out from the CER, there was some consternation from folks who work on climate policy, and the fact that it didn't include a net zero scenario, despite the fact that Canada has a legislated net zero target. It also didn't factor into a net zero scenario what that would mean in terms of if globally we were achieving net zero, the implications for Canada's oil and gas sector in terms of what it would mean for them. So consequently, Minister Wilkinson, Federal Minister for Natural Resources Canada, sent a letter to the Canadian Energy Regulator and requested or directed that included in the next set of scenarios they include a net zero scenario, including if the world is heading to net zero. So not just what does it look like for Canada's energy sector if we're achieving net zero domestically, but if the world is achieving net zero, implications given that we export a lot of energy. So that is set to be released later this spring. Curious for each of your perspectives on, you know, crystal ball here, like what do you expect that scenario is going to look like? What do you think it's going to mean for Canadian oil and gas production? Do you think it's possible that we could still see them projecting an increase in oil and gas production? So yeah, maybe just hear from each of you, and then after that we'll wind things up. Why don't we start with Olivier and then Jan, and we'll finish with Caroline. Okay,
sure. Thanks. So I think that they have a very tough task ahead of them. I think it will be difficult to create, indeed, a net zero plan that addresses the goals of the Paris Agreement that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is explicit in their mandate now, which is really great to see. However, I think it's very difficult to model such a pathway for Canada that has an increase in oil and gas production. As I explained before, it's just globally, like all models show that we need to phase out oil and gas production at by about 20 to 30% by 2030, already, and by minimum 65% by 2050. And so if we're to address the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacity on top of that, which is also central to the Paris Agreement, then I assume that we would need to see an even faster phase out than is indicated in the global baseline. So I'm really much looking forward to see this this scenario, and then I'll hand over to Caroline for her thoughts. Or was it Jan first, or? Okay, yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
I think it's me. I think what I'm hoping to see is really, I think the IEA has done a lot of great work, and if we can see an interpolation of the IEA net zero scenario to Canada, I think that would be my hope. And we've seen the IEA for the first time has shown what the implications of their scenarios are for Canadian production, but they didn't actually show it for the net zero scenario. They showed it for the other two. And as Dan said, I think this is a really important step in the process, because these scenarios are really foundational to a lot of the policy planning that happens in Canada. And so getting this CR net zero scenario is a really key step in ensuring that we plan our policies with the right end goal in mind.
I was really delighted to hear that the CER would develop a net zero scenario for the first time. I think, you know, as I said in my first intervention in my presentation, these modeling exercises can be really important in framing a discourse in Canada around what's needed, what's the goal that's worthy, and CER being, you know, in a way that the IEA is a global authority on global energy transitions. I think the CER in Canada has been that authoritative voice, and historically hasn't run a net zero compatible scenario and will. So I'm hopeful that this can maybe be an inflection point in how we talk about energy transitions in Canada. In terms of what may come of it, you know, we've been in consultation with the CER. We know the modelers. You know, I personally have good faith in their abilities. And the fact that they have this explicit directive now to model net zero in Canada and globally, I think is a really good sign. So I'm optimistic about what we'll see around oil and gas production. I agree with Olivier, especially if we're modeling a scenario where the rest of the world gets to 1.5. It's not really feasible to imagine continued oil and gas production in Canada. Where I'll be looking though is what happens to LNG, particularly if there is a scenario that they model where the rest of the world doesn't get to 1.5, where the world moves a little bit more slowly. I think there could be room there for, again, some of that nuance that I talked about earlier. So that's going to be the page that I'll be flipping to when this report comes out. But overall, hopeful and really just delighted that this exercise is even taking place.
Great, thank you. All right, well, we are coming up on time here, so I will throw back to Laura to wrap things up.
There we go, I'm muted. Someone had to do it, you know, we've done well for 90 minutes. So thank you so much, Dan, and to all of our wonderful speakers for that really, really rich discussion. There was a lot there, and thank you to everyone for tuning in and for your questions. If there were any burning questions unanswered, feel free to reach out to us. You can find us on our IISD Energy channels or directly to the speakers who shared their contact information. And we will have a recording of the webinar that will be posted on our IISD YouTube channel and will be sent out automatically to everyone who registered. So if you missed anything or want to loop back, you'll find it there. So thanks very much, and we'll leave it there. Have a great day.